Hello there, and can I take the opportunity to wish you a very Merry Christmas. Today I'm treating myself to a bottle of one of Italy's finest wines, Tenuta San Guido Sassicaia, and this is the 2010 vintage of that, which I'm hoping is going to be a lovely mature wine. 2010 is quite an interesting vintage because a cool wet spring in fact, led to late flowering that put the whole vintage back and gave quite a small crop that stayed on the vine longer into the autumn. And as a result, the 2010 vintage of Sassicaia is better known for its elegance than necessarily its power. I've seen different critics with different opinions as to quite how good this is. So I'll be interested to taste this, see if I find the wine elegant, and see if that elegance actually makes up for the fact that the wine may not be quite as powerful as it normally is. Now, I've said that Sassicaia is one of Italy's leading wines, but actually in a country with a tradition of winemaking that goes back many centuries, Sassicaia is a relatively recently developed brand. Its genesis having come in the 1940s, when Marchese Piero Antinori della Rocchetta started planting vines as an experiment, almost as a hobby, and the wine's actually only been marketed since 1971. Evidently, Mario first became enchanted by wine as a boy, aged 14, when he was only allowed to taste it and not drink it. And he'd his grandfather's, and he'd been allowed to taste some old Bordeaux. Then, as a student studying in Pisa several years later, he got to taste and drink old Bordeaux. Some notes I've seen have him talking about having drunk 1924 Chateau Margaux, for instance. And this gave him a desire to make this sort of wine himself. Now, in 1930, Mario married Clarice della Rocchetta, and the couple were given the Tenuta San Guido estate by her parents, and this gave the Marchese a suitable plot to plant these experimental Cabernet Sauvignon vines that he'd so wanted to do. Having made the first of these wines, he gave it to some locals to try in the spring following the vintage, and they, trying the wine far too young and not being used to structured wines, told him it was disgusting. And so after a couple of vintages, he moved his focus slightly away from the Cabernet Sauvignon that he'd planted to some Caniolo that he'd also tried growing. And he watched the wine he'd made from Caniolo, and over the next 20 years, he found it developed into a wine that he really enjoyed. He had, however, put some of the early Cabernet Sauvignons that he'd made aside. Buoyed up by the success of his Caniolo, he tried the Cabernet Sauvignon, offered it to guests, friends and family to try. And so, in the mid-1960s, actually found that he'd made a wine that with age had turned out to be quite impressive. Now, Mario's nephew by marriage, Piero Antinori, managed to persuade him to release the 1968 vintage of this wine commercially in 1971. And Antinori leveraged his company's existing commercial distribution network to bring Sassicaia to market. And they also involved Antinori's chief winemaker, somebody called Giacomo Tachis, in the making of the wine. And at this stage, Tachis was making regular visits to Bordeaux, where he would encounter the very influential enologist of the time, Émile Peynaud. And these encounters gave him the ability to fine-tune and refine the wine. So it was thanks to him that they adopted modern techniques, such as temperature-controlled fermentation in stainless steel tanks and aging in French oak barrels. And this work very quickly established Sassicaia as a world-class Bordeaux-style wine. And because this wine had no appellation, it initially had to be sold as a Vino da Tavola. So what they've done here was launch the Super Tuscan movement. Now, Tenuta San Guido is a very large estate. They have 2,500 hectares. And of that, there's approximately 120 hectares that are vineyards, of which only 100 hectares are designated for the production of DOC Bolgheri Sassicaia, this wine. The estate also produces two other wines, Guidalberto and Le Difese. But much of the land on the estate is given over to forestry. They have a successful racing stable here. There are olive groves, and there is an area of wetland down by the sea that's maintained as a reserve for migratory birds. Now, the property runs inland from the beach, with the oldest and the highest altitude vineyards, invariably those furthest from the sea, being the plots that are used to produce Sassicaia. And thus it is that the younger vineyards at lower altitudes provide fruit that goes into Guidalberto and Le Difese. So principally, the Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc vines that provide the fruit for this wine are grown on 5 plots of the estate's vineyards. These are Castiglioncello, Aya Nueva, Cerreta, Sassicaia da Sopra and San Martino. Now, these vineyard soils, as they would be across 5 vineyards, are varied and complex, but they have plenty of limestone content because the hills here are in fact an ancient seabed that's been pushed upwards. The soil is rich in marl and in pebbles, in stones, hence the name Sassicaia, meaning field of stones, and is also partially clayey. And the vineyards are located at altitudes between 80 and 400 metres above sea level. As I've intimated, the climate in 2010 was quite a key to the style of wine that was produced. It was a long, harsh winter. There wasn't quite as much snow as there'd been the previous year, but nonetheless the vines were able to achieve dormancy. Following on from a very cold winter, it was a cool, rainy spring. In fact, the last of the snows had only fallen here in mid-March, and periods of heavy rainfall continued into May. As a result of delayed flowering and fruit set, vegetative development was delayed. From the first 10 days of June, however, temperatures returned to a level where they were in line with seasonal averages. However, there was a large fluctuation between day and night temperature, and that favoured the development of aromas in the fruit. Now, the development of the plants was aided by a very hot and sunny July, with a total absence of rainfall. August was warm, there was 70 millimetres of rain, but temperatures didn't exceed 32 degrees Celsius. Harvest took place between 2 and 3 weeks later than usual due to the delays because of the cool spring. And the fruit never really quite recovered this delay through the season. There was fine weather and sunny, breezy days for harvest. Picking started in the 3rd week of September and finished with the Cabernet Franc in mid-October. Given the circumstances, the grapes had achieved full ripeness and had good polyphenolic development. And so relatively low sugars giving fairly moderate alcohol is actually quite consistent with the style that Sassicaia are aiming for. Given the conditions, I'm sure there was very careful sorting went on at grape reception. The fruit was destemmed, it was crushed and went into stainless steel tanks for fermentation. The fermentation temperatures were regulated to around 30 to 31 degrees C, so relatively warm, but not allowing the yeasts to get so hot as to shock themselves and stop fermentation. Maceration with the skins went on for 2 weeks, and during that period they were practicing both pumping over, so taking juice from the bottom of the tank and pumping it over the cap of skins at the top, and also délestage, or rack and return, where you pump all the must or wine out of the tank, put it into another tank, and then return it back on top of the cap of skin. Malolactic conversion was then completed in tank before the wines went into barrel. Throughout this process, the different vineyard plots had been vinified separately, and those different lots stayed separated throughout most of the maturation process. Now, the final blend for the 2010 vintage, very classic for Sassicaia, they say 85% of Cabernet Sauvignon with 15% of Cabernet Franc. So following malolactic conversion, the wine went into barrel. These were predominantly French oak, although they do say a small amount of American oak was also used. These were 225 litre barrels, and the notes say that 60% of them were new, so the remaining 40% will have been second and third fill barrels. Barrel aging for Sassicaia will normally take between 20 and 25 months, depending on the vintage. For 2010, they give a figure of 24 months aging. And following bottle, the wine then ages for a further 6 months in the estate cellars prior to release. So let's take a look at the wine, shall we? The wine has a good depth of colour. It's a dark red, but actually in terms of its depth, it's not quite opaque. I can see through it. It's a ruby colour with a vibrant orange hue at the rim. I'm swirling it. The wine is labelled as having 13.5% alcohol. It's clinging fairly readily to the side of the glass there. I'm guessing it's a fairly tannic wine. It's taking a little while to form some tears, but as I'm talking, I'm swirling the wine and I'm getting some beautiful aromas coming off, some very classic sort of notes of lifted, almost sort of red soft fruit notes, moving on to a richer sort of blood orange note. That's very attractive. The aromas seem quite precise. They've opened up a little since I first opened this. There were notes of tobacco, cedar, a little bit of forest floor development. Now, alongside that really sort of beautiful blood orange note, getting the slightest hint of soy, of mushroom, and of truffle. There's perhaps underlying licoriceiness, but again, those beautiful notes of soft red fruit and blood orange just dancing across the top of the wine. I have observed this before. I could spend a lot of time just concentrating on the aromas of Sassicaia. I think there are times when it can be ethereally beautiful, and this is at a very nice stage at the moment. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate, we start with red fruit notes. There's cranberry. There are hints of juicy red cherry. There is a rich plumminess, but as well as this plummy core, there's a really lively note of that quite exciting red currant and cranberry coming through. I think one of the things that's underpinning that, of course, is the wine has superb acidity. Because the alcohol is relatively moderate, these lovely perfumes have free rein and they're not being overwhelmed. Given that this is a wine that has spent 2 years in quite a high proportion of new oak, that's all beautifully married in there. As the wine is developing on my palate, the red fruits are receding a little, and I'm starting to see the beginnings of savoury notes, bits of soy, umami. The lively acidity is making me salivate. That's bringing along the start of some pungent notes of oyster mushroom. The wine structure is incredibly fine. The smoothness is silky, it's chocolatey smooth. There isn't a sort of a graininess or a velvetiness to it. The amount of time it's spent in barrel has ensured that everything is so beautifully integrated. This really is a seamless wine. Perhaps one of the things about the 2010 vintage is it's not absolutely exploding on my palate. It's just very gently evolving there, with lively blood orange, red currant and cranberry notes, leading on to a fairly mellow core of rich, ripe plum. As usual for Sassicaia, the wine's incredibly difficult to describe. There's something completely ethereal about its beauty. It's not a huge wine. It's a wine that relies on beautiful perfume, nervous acidity and a fabulously integrated structure. And these do last beautifully well. If I have a criticism, I think it's that I'd like to see these flavours developing a little further on the back palate, which I don't currently find they are. It's very easy to say these things and then find in a subsequent glass they do develop further. But just at the moment, I'm not seeing that. At the same time, I think that this bottle is currently showing me just how beautiful the wines of Sassicaia can be. It's elegant, it's confident, it's refreshing, and despite the fact it's a 15-year-old wine, it's showing ravishingly beautiful fruit that's just starting to hint at development for the future. This is a wine where I've seen people suggest its drinking window should be out to 2040. I see the wine having no difficulty aging that far, and I think it could well go further. Almost certainly, if you leave it longer, you will get more of those sort of savoury tertiary development notes. And maybe you'll get that greater complexity on the back palate. However, just at the moment, I think this is a wine that's showing a beautiful and wonderfully attractive preciseness, nervosity and energy to its fruit. And I think it's a wine that's beautiful to drink now. And I feel I'm very privileged to be sharing it with you. So thank you for joining me. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this wine, and of course it's an aggregation, and this is being marked as 93 out of 100. Some of the higher scoring critics who were looking more at its elegance and its beauty scored it more in the mid-90s. However, I think some critics were looking for greater power and density and scored it further down. I think you probably realised I'm coming down more on the side of loving the wine's elegance, so I would be scoring this 95 out of 100. The 2010 is currently an absolutely enchanting example of Sassicaia and should delight anybody who tastes it. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope that if you've enjoyed the tasting, you'll press the like button. I also hope that if you're watching these tastings and you enjoy them, that you'll consider subscribing to the channel. It's all right, it doesn't cost anything, but your subscription will help me to grow the channel. To that end, if you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your support in that way. And if you have any comments you'd like to leave, do please pop them in the box below. I would love to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and you can go there and you can see its price and if it's available in your market. I will also leave a link to a tasting I did of the 2023 Guidalberto, one of the other wines from Tenuta San Guido. So you might want to follow that link and watch that video as well. So thank you again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe if you have some time, you'll come back and you'll join me for some more video tastings in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.